So recently I noticed a trend that a lot of people have started picking up cameras again for the purposes of photography. And I'm talking about cameras other than your iPhone, like a physical, actual camera that you bring with you that doesn't send texts or make phone calls. And this has been really refreshing because obviously with the rise of short form video in the last couple of years, photography has been honestly really dead. Me personally, I went from posting only photos on Instagram over the course of like a year and a half to now only posting videos and reels and short form content and just really taking photos for myself. But I've noticed lately that a lot of people are not only picking up cameras to post and document their lives, but they're also posting them again to Instagram, which again is just really nice to see. So in this video, I'm gonna be talking you through two cameras that I think are amazing for photography, specifically for beginners who are ready to leave behind their iPhone and get something with a little bit better quality in order to document their lives and hopefully show off those amazing moments. Now, I do have two options and I'm gonna cover the more expensive one first, and the one that you probably know. My second camera is a real sleeper pick and the one that I think you should personally go with, especially if you're on a budget. But let's talk about the superstar first, which is the Fujifilm X100VI. And you've undoubtedly seen this camera or its predecessor, the Fujifilm X100VI, somewhere on social media where it first went viral, and now they're just literally impossible to find. And this is the perfect beginner camera for so many reasons for most people, and we're gonna cover those right now. Firstly, it's just so small and it's so tiny, which is one of the biggest advantages of this camera. It's pretty much the same size as my iPhone. Obviously, the density or the width of it is much larger since it has an actual physical lens on it, but the size of this camera makes it amazing to travel with and to just move around and take with you. I could probably fit this in one of my jacket or my hoodie pockets, which is just awesome. Also, it looks beautiful, which is really not the case for a lot of bigger cameras. They're kind of bigger and clunky and don't look the best. The Fujifilm X100VI is also more than a camera in my opinion. It's also a fashion statement. Like, I love carrying this and usually it goes well with an outfit and I think it looks pretty cool. Now, beyond just the aesthetics of this camera, it takes absolutely incredible photos. Now, you might have a cell phone that has a ton of megapixels. So for example, if you're shooting on the S24 Ultra, you can take 200 megapixel photos. Now, this camera is a 45 megapixel sensor, so it's lower than the S24 Ultra. However, the sensor size inside this camera is significantly bigger than your smartphone, and that's what affects image quality. So if you're coming from a smartphone, I wouldn't get too hung up on the megapixel count and things like that. It's really the sensor size that matters, and this has an APS-C sensor, which is significantly bigger than a sensor inside of a smartphone, which allows the camera to take in more light, basically making it better for low light photography and increasing the quality of your images. However, my favorite thing when it comes to the Fujifilm X100VI is actually unique to Fujifilm, which is why this camera is here on this two camera list, which is not really a list, but these two cameras that I think are really good for beginners for photography specifically. It has something called film simulations. Now, basically that's just a bunch of settings that you change in your camera to adjust certain values, which creates a preset or a filter that goes on every single image that you take. And that means that you can basically shoot as many photos as you want and never have to edit, which is great for beginners because most people don't want to be sitting at their computer learn to edit forever. So if you're someone that just wants something directly out of the camera, you want to take a photo and you want to be able to post it immediately, this is the perfect camera for that. Now, if you're wondering where you can get some of these film simulations, there's actually a website called Fuji X Weekly where you can go, where people have posted their own settings for how they get specific looks. You can just copy those, put them into your camera, and just like that, you have a ton of filters to choose from until you find a look that you're comfortable with. Now, this is especially good for people who want to share very quickly because it's able to connect to your phone via an app. So I can literally just transfer the photos I take from my camera immediately to my phone and just post them. It's a really good workflow for getting things from your camera to your phone super quickly to post without ever having to edit or having to touch a computer. Now, just because it has film simulations built in and you don't need to edit your photos doesn't mean you can't. This camera is capable of taking a photo with a film simulation applied and a raw photo at the same time. So that way you get a photo you don't have to edit, and you also get a raw photo that you can learn to edit on your own time, or you can sort of grow into as you move on. And that's my favorite part about this camera. It's friendly for both beginners and professionals. It's something that you can pick up as your first camera and be able to take amazing photos right away, but then also grow with as you grow as a photographer or an editor, and have that flexibility to really change your images in post, which I really like about this camera. Now, just like every other camera, it doesn't come with only pros, it also has a ton of cons. The biggest one being availability and price. Because of the virality of this camera, similar to the X100V, even though Fujifilm promised that production would be ramping up, it's almost impossible to find the Fujifilm X100VI where I live personally, which is in Toronto, Canada. So if you live here and you can't find the camera, then I feel you. I pre-ordered this on release day, and that's the only reason I have it right now, because I sort of had a feeling that they would sell out. But mostly everywhere I've checked, it's impossible to find this camera, or you just order it on pre-order, and I know a ton of people that have been waiting forever and they still haven't gotten it. So availability is a big issue. Secondly, it's also expensive if you're able to find it. In Canada, this costs around $2,400, I think, pre-tax. I can't remember, or maybe post-tax. But regardless, it's an expensive camera for it being around $2,400, and that's not always a budget that most beginners or casuals have for their first camera. That's a lot of money. So those are the two major drawbacks in my opinion when it comes to actually finding it and being able to obtain it. Then when you actually have it, the biggest drawback in my opinion for growing as a photographer, and maybe some people will look at this as a pro, but the lens on this is fixed and you can't zoom in, meaning that I can't remove this lens from this camera no matter what I do. So this is the only lens that I can shoot, meaning that I'm stuck at this focal length. So if you're a beginner, this is set to a full frame equivalent of 35 millimeters, which is just basically a zoom range that you're fixed at and you're stuck with. Now, in my personal opinion, the reason that most people love this camera is, again, because of the size and the image quality. And for me, I think this is a perfect camera for someone who already has a decent professional camera as a second fun camera. So while it's great for beginner photographers, I think you'd be better off buying maybe something a little bit cheaper and buying something that you're able to actually swap lenses on. Okay, so quickly before we move on to the second camera, and the one that I actually recommend for photography that not a lot of photographers will, I want to talk about this video sponsor, and that's Luminar Neo. Now, we touched on editing and taking raw photos and learning to edit those photos as you grow and you become more of an experienced photographer. Luminar Neo is the best AI editing tool that I've honestly ever used, and is a tool that I've been using recently to edit all of my photos, and I just absolutely love it. Now, it has a ton of AI features built in that make editing a lot more pain-free, because as a beginner, you are gonna make a ton of mistakes in your photography that otherwise without Luminar, you might not have been able to fix. And they have a ton of guides which really make it easy for you to learn how to edit your raw photos and become a photographer. Now, my favorite feature on Luminar AI is probably super sharp AI, and what this does is that if you ever take a photo out of focus, which trust me, as a beginner photographer you will, and it just looks completely janked up and you think you can't use it, you're actually able to save that image with super sharp AI as it snaps it back into focus. So let me just quickly show you how that works. So we have this photo here of this iceberg on this beach, and you can see the focus was completely missed. Now, if I go into super sharp AI and I select one of these sharpness settings, you're gonna notice that it instantly snaps it back. So for this photo, it's not that out of focus. I'm gonna go ahead and pick low, and just like that, you can see that it brings the photo back into focus, and that's just absolutely incredible, because otherwise this photo would have been unusable. Now, if I only want to bring back the focus in that specific iceberg and not the environment around it, I can even create a mask, add it on top of the iceberg, and isolate the effect to just that area, which is super clutch if you still want to maintain some motion blur or some kind of depth of field in your photos. My favorite part about Luminar AI is they've now introduced this model where you can buy a license in perpetuity, meaning that you just pay once and now you have this service forever. You don't need to pay in monthly installments or anything like that. So once again, I just want to quickly thank Luminar Neo for sponsoring this week's video. They are my favorite AI photo editor at the moment, and I'll have a link in the description below where you can check out all of these awesome deals. Okay, so now that we're armed with the ability to edit our photos, I want to introduce to you the second camera, which I think is awesome for casual beginner photographers. And if you saw the title of this video, then you can probably guess what brand it's from. It is from Canon, And this camera is almost 5 years old now, and that's probably why you won't see a lot of people recommending it, but I think it is incredible, and it's called the Canon EOS RP. This was my first professional camera, so I am a little bit biased, but stick with me here. Because of how old it is, you can get this camera for under $1,000 now, including a pancake lens like this. This is just a 50mm 1.8, a super cheap lens. Now, this camera has a ton of advantages over the Fujifilm. Firstly, right off the bat, you can change lenses. So this lens can come off and I can really play around with the type of focal lengths that I want and experiment with different styles of photography, which you can do with the Fujifilm, which is a more expensive camera. The quality coming out of this camera is just absolutely insane. It's 24 megapixels, which is lower than the Fujifilm. However, this has a full frame sensor. So the sensor on this is much bigger than the Fujifilm, which is an APS-C sensor. And that's something that you're not really gonna find. You'll never find a camera at this price point that has a full frame sensor. So this is really a rare breed from Canon, which is what makes it so attractive, especially at the price point. And you get something super sneaky and super valuable with this camera. This camera has the RF mount. Now, this is the latest mount system for Canon's lenses, meaning that I could put the lens that I'm using on my $5,000 cinema camera right now onto this Canon EOS RP, or I could buy the cheapest possible lens that I can find on Amazon or Craigslist or whatever. This means that you're really able to set aside an appropriate budget for whatever lens you can afford at the time. And if you invest into more expensive lenses as you grow as a photographer, and over the next couple of years, you decide that, hey, I'm ready to upgrade from this EOS RP body to a more professional body like the Canon R5 or a Canon R6 Mark II, for example, you're able to take all of those lenses with you and you don't have to sell them, which makes this camera a super valuable entry point into the Canon ecosystem specifically, even though it's 5 years old, which again, just absolutely blows my mind. And of course, just like the Fujifilm, this does have some drawbacks. It's not a perfect camera, and it wasn't a perfect camera when it was first released. Right off the bat, this thing sucks for video. Now, I know that this video is about photography and finding a camera for photographers, and it is, but at some point you're gonna wanna experiment into video as most photographers do. And if you're gonna use this, I would just highly recommend not doing it because the video on this is absolutely terrible, and that's a huge advantage the Fujifilm has over this. The Fujifilm is able to shoot in up to 6.2K at around 24 frames per second, and the video quality coming out of that camera is actually amazing. I was really impressed. I have a whole other video on the day in the life with the Fujifilm and what the video looks like even vlogging with that camera. So if you want to check that video out, I'll leave that link somewhere below. But the video on that camera is fantastic, and the video on this camera unfortunately sucks. This camera also does not have IBIS, so that means in-body image stabilization, meaning that if you're at really low shutter speeds and there's some kind of wobble when you're taking a photo, you're gonna introduce some motion blur into your photos. Whereas the Fujifilm does have IBIS, so even if you have shaky hands and you're using a lower shutter speed because you need more light in a certain scenario, or just because it's really dark or something like that, your photo is not gonna turn out to be blurry. So that is another disadvantage of this camera. But again, for under $1,000, you're not gonna find a full frame camera from Canon with the RF mount with a 24 megapixel sensor. So yeah, if you were wondering what I think are some of the best cameras for beginners or casual photographers specifically, these two are really it. The Fujifilm X100VI is the more high-end option that can do more things but locks you into a single lens system and probably one type of photography, whereas the Canon EOS RP is probably the cheapest full-frame camera you'll find that lets you get into the RF mount conveniently and lets you start to build an arsenal of lenses and learn many types of photographies to eventually evolve into more of a pro photographer. So if that's your goal, you want more long-term success, this is the camera that I would pick. And if you're hoping for some short-term payoff to get some really good photos, the Fujifilm X100VI is what I would pick. Anyways, that's it for this video. Hopefully you guys learned something. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, keep creating.